Thank you for your kind words, Jan. Thank you for inviting me, giving me this opportunity. It's a pleasure to be here. 20 years of the euro. Disillusion is one thing. It's far more worrying that, as far as I can see, there's still plenty of denial and illusion. So the main point I'm going to highlight today is that the euro, the Maastricht Treaty, is very much a product of its time. It marked the convergence of, on the one hand, Germany's peculiar ordoliberalism, which I think might be more fairly called ordo-mercantilism, on the one hand, and on the other hand, the influence of neoliberalism, Anglo-Saxon neoliberalism, and how that shaped mainstream macroeconomics. So the first current gave us the euro model, which is the German model, and the second current meant that mainstream macroeconomists didn't quite see much of a problem with it. I will start with talking about Germany, ordoliberalism, West Germany's post-war history under the Deutschmark, and how that shaped the euro, and then talk about the evolution of OCA, optimum currency area theory, in the context of the mainstream's unlearning of macroeconomics. Then I will talk about the Maastricht moment when these two currents converged, point out a few of the starkest ironies that we are observing today, give you some personal memories, and conclude. So in talking about West Germany's post-war history under the Deutschmark, 3 points. First of all, Germany has a long history of running current account surpluses. It's kind of structurally entrenched, it seems. And this is related to the German model and part of the Deutschmark nationalism, part of the Wirtschaftswunder, economic miracle. Secondly, what was the Bundesbank's role in all this? And I will emphasize the Bundesbank's part was to act as the enforcer of superior internal discipline. Thirdly, I will point out a fallacy of composition in exporting a model that worked for Germany under peculiar historical conditions and exported to Europe when those conditions were not fulfilled. So let me start with Germany's long history of external imbalances, of running significant, sizable current account surpluses, most of the time, mainly driven by merchandise surpluses, traditionally services deficit, secondary income obviously also. Primary income wasn't much of a factor until the euro. So under the euro we see that current account surpluses really exploded, driven not only by merchandise exports, but also by shrinking service deficits and primary income surpluses due to foreign asset accumulation. Now, there were a few instances when Germany had deficits, and the first one is perhaps the most important, 50-51, so this was early on. Germany's central bank was established in 48, Federal Republic in 49, and in 50-51 Germany had a balance of payments crisis when obviously Germany had no dollar reserves, no gold reserves, and so on. So this was a critical moment when two important figures conspired a plan, namely Wilhelm Focke, former Reichsbanker and the key figure at the Bank Deutscher Länder, and Ludwig Erhard, Germany's famous economics minister at the time. They came up with the idea that Germany should organize superior internal discipline, überlegene interne Disziplin. Now, Germans love discipline, so this was a great idea. It worked. It convinced everyone, so to speak, implicitly. So ever since then, Germany was in the Bretton Woods system at the time, had a fixed exchange rate, and the plan was to keep German inflation below everybody else's inflation, to improve competitiveness and stimulate exports in this way. And this is really the German model. Germany made a habit out of this. It has never changed, not until today. The other part was, of course, to resist Deutschmark appreciation as long as possible, to reap the benefits of this superior internal discipline. So this is really the background to Germany's outstanding export orientation and export dependency. Germany is currently experiencing the downsides of that. The model is really structurally entrenched, it seems. Germany has a long history of doing this. Now notice, it also worked, is this working? Yes. It also worked under the European monetary system. Then German unification temporarily rebalanced Europe, but under the euro, Germany then managed to catapult its external surpluses into unknown territories. Now, what was the Bundesbank's role in all this? The Bundesbank's part was to act as the enforcer of discipline. So the Bundesbank part was to make sure that wage inflation was low and that budget deficits were low. The Bundesbank had to discipline finance ministers and unions, essentially. Another part of this is, of course, this idea that Germany had two hyperinflations and apparently no deflation. This is the story we hear from people like Hans Tietmeyer, former Bundesbank president. And it follows that Germany needs a very independent central bank which has to play this role as enforcer of discipline. Germany had brief experiences with Keynesianism, and so the 70s, people like Ottmar Issing will tell you that this led to instability, it led to straw fires, so we cannot have that kind of thing. Instead, we need a central bank that essentially acts asymmetrically, always ready to break, to enforce discipline, but never ready to stimulate because we wait for exports to stimulate our economy. We wait for other countries to do the job. Now, the trouble here is the fallacy of composition, namely that this strategy, the German model, only worked for Germany because and as long as others behave differently. Now, if you export this model to Europe, then you are creating a problem. You're creating an even bigger problem if, after exporting this model, you go into overdrive, which is what Germany did. So this is showing unit labor cost trends, and you can clearly see that Germany, under the euro, until the crisis, was the clear outlier. Essentially, Germany, during this period, went through an internal devaluation, and for no good reason. The argument was to restore its competitiveness, but there was no need to restore its competitiveness. It was just that the German model was no longer working, and the knee-jerk reaction was, oh, we have to restore our competitiveness, and that's what Germany went out to do. Of course, German performance during this period was not good. Germany was known as the sick man of the euro during this period. But the trouble is, however, by creating those imbalances, you have, of course, the other side, the other countries running up debts, right? And they accumulate more and more debts and will eventually run into trouble. So this is really what I call Germany's euro trilemma. If you run persistent export surpluses, eventually the counterparts you will drive them into bankruptcy, eventually. So you end up with a transfer union of a kind. Unless, of course, the central bank helps you and buys up all the stuff and kind of keeps things going, which is the state at which we are now. And I'll talk about the ECB a little more in a moment. Now, let me now move on to optimum currency area theory, and the point here is to emphasize that this is not an asymmetric shock, right? Optimum currency area theory is obsessed with asymmetric shocks. This is not an asymmetric shock. This is diverging national trends in wages and prices. This is not some kind of external shock. This is something that in the pre-Euro times, when the authorities still understood that the exchange rate, i.e. competitiveness, was a matter of common concern, that was still understood at the time. Funny enough, when the euro was launched, this important point was forgotten, and Germany went into internal devaluation. Okay, let me move on and talk about OCA and the mainstream. Now, OCA, of course, started out with this idea of exchange rates as an adjustment mechanism in case of asymmetric shocks. So it was kind of Keynesian to some extent originally. Over time, it really became more and more a supply-side story about flexibility and structural reforms and insurance mechanisms and so on. This started with Mandel in the 70s. Now, if you look at the parallel evolution of macroeconomics away from Friedman when monetary policy was still very powerful, to Lucas, and eventually to time inconsistency and all these macroeconomic ideas, allegedly, where you end up with the conclusion that you need an independent central bank to control inflation, and you need to discipline your fiscal policy to avoid excessive deficits and fiscal dominance. Well, then you have really arrived in the German neoliberal paralysis. So this is the convergence I refer to, and I'll come back to that in a moment. Now, let me just say a few more things about the exchange rate. So the exchange rate was seen as an adjustment mechanism when asymmetric shocks hit a monetary union. If it's no longer available, then you need flexibility, a point that Paul talked about. And this is kind of the structural reform mantra that inspired a lot of things in Europe, of course. Now notice that if you follow the logic of this theory, then those diverging national wage and price trends, they are what would cause an asymmetric shock of kinds that you would need to offset with an exchange rate adjustment. Right? So you just have to follow the logic of this theory to understand that those divergences in unit labor costs are very critical. You have to avoid them. The same thing, and I already mentioned that, is if you remember the experience of the 30s when beggar-thy-neighbor policies were the only game in town, and when European integration started and the authorities always understood that the exchange rate is a matter of common concern, then this again is kind of at the center of attention. You have to make sure you do not run into these competitiveness imbalances. Somehow we managed to forget that. But let me emphasize another point about OCA theory, namely this obsession with asymmetric shocks. Right? So there's this distinction, symmetric versus asymmetric shocks, and the theory, empirical research, and policy ideas up to today are really concerned with this right-hand side. So is there a lack of labor mobility? Well, then we need structural reforms. Kennan originally emphasized fiscal federalism. Today we tell us we can't have that, and if at all, then it has to be a kind of fiscal union that deals with asymmetric shocks, so the unemployment reinsurance scheme and ideas of this kind. If we're lacking financial integration, the mutual insurance thing through private markets, this is where the banking union, capital markets union initiatives come in. So everything is happening on the right-hand side. Nobody seems to pay much attention to the other side here. And oops, what happened now? Okay. So let me talk about this convergence. As I said, the Bundesbank experience, the German model, the success story gave us the euro. It's essentially based on German ideas. The independent central bank focused on price stability paired with fiscal discipline. The evolution of mainstream macroeconomics meant that most macroeconomists at the time did not see much of a problem with this. Everybody, look at late 80s, early 90s, everybody had convinced themselves that You need an independent central bank that is preoccupied with inflation only, and you need disciplined fiscal policy. And then you have basically a stable economy. If there are any problems, then you need structural reforms. So that's kind of the basics of the neoliberal story, which had converged to what Germans always thought. And if you read the works of Ottmar Issing, he would tell you exactly that. The international economists had finally caught up with what German economists had always understood. Central bank independence, price stability, fiscal discipline, and then you're fine. Okay, so to me, looking at this regime, I see asymmetry. I see asymmetry in capital ladders all over the place. The Maastricht regime is institutionalized asymmetry. Inflation can only be too high, can never be too low. Remember, the ECB started out with below 2%, right? Clearly asymmetric. Budget deficits can only be too high. They can never be too low. Budget surpluses can never be too high. The black zero can never be black enough. All good. Below 3%, right? Clearly asymmetric. Clearly asymmetric. Now, as I said, we forgot about the competitiveness thing. That's nowhere written down. But if you look at the language used during the crisis, it was all about countries that had lost their competitiveness. Nobody talks about gaining competitiveness, about über-competitiveness. Über-competitiveness can never be a problem, it seems. It's only losing competitiveness that is a problem. And the nice thing about this is, of course, that this is the element to put downward pressure on wages, and I don't have to tell you whom that kind of thing is suiting very well. Okay, so the Maastricht regime is all about asymmetry, and the influence of neoliberalism on mainstream macroeconomics is very much in line with this, because ever since the 70s, the profession has been obsessed with stagflation of the 70s. We have been fighting the 70s stagflation war ever since. Now for Europe, very briefly, this has been very costly, of course. And let me just quickly point out what I see as the three key blunders. First of all, this blind faith in market liberalization without policy integration, which has proved a disaster in terms of finance and banking in particular. Then Europe's failure to prevent those internal divergences in competitiveness, which inevitably lead to the buildup of imbalances, which will eventually blow up. Again, in pre-Euro times, we understood this issue. Exchange rates were a matter of common concern. Finally, this lack of concern with common shocks, this preoccupation with asymmetric shocks. So, when the crisis happened, the euro area was unprepared to cope with common shocks and with overcoming the crisis, and that too was kind of part of the decades of unlearning macroeconomics and forgetting about demand-side management, being preoccupied with the supply side. Getting back to my former schemata here, I emphasize that this is where academia focuses, this is where officialdom focuses, this is where current debates focus. I see the problems here on the left side, dealing with common shocks. The failures were partly monetary policy. The ECB was an asymmetric central bank to start with. Then it ran into all sorts of problems that made their life difficult, right? Germans like to go to their constitutional court when there is something happening in this area. Fiscal policy, fiscal stance, Agnès referred to a deflationary bias. I absolutely agree with that. So fiscal policy, fiscal stance, persistently wrong. So the euro area suffers from a persistently inadequate macro policy mix. And add to this what Charles Goodhart, before the euro, pointed out as kind of the Achilles heel, this divorce between fiscal and monetary policy, which played out during the crisis, the famous doom loop, right? This is, I think, where the key problems played out, not on the right-hand side, on the left-hand side. So notice what happened. The mainstream has been fighting the 70s stagflation war, and where did we end up? We ended up in stag deflation. There's a lot of talk about the risk of the Japanification of Europe, and for good reason, it seems to me, right? So employees are not asking for higher wages anymore. Governments are only preoccupied with hiking taxes and cutting spending. And obviously, this is crowding in public investment as well. Corporations don't like to invest anymore either. Germany's Euro trilemma that I referred to earlier, right? If Germany runs up these current account surpluses, accumulates foreign claims against countries which eventually are bound to go bust over their rising indebtedness. This is where the ECB comes in. Buying up troubled assets, reducing interest rates of troubled countries, and that's really the only thing that has kept the euro alive during this period. So without the ECB, Germany would have seen its euro trilemma come home in a very harsh way. And this is, of course, also in line with the negative interest rates by the ECB that we're observing now. The situation is so dismal that the ECB is administering negative interest rates to help the debtor countries survive. Now, what's happening in Germany? Not much. Germany continues to live in its parallel universe that Mr. Schäuble famously referred to some time ago. It's just that Germany no longer seems to like the fact that its safe haven status now gives Germany the most negative interest rates. Germany continues to refuse to rebalance, but doesn't seem to understand that there's really just a choice between two things. It's either the Draghi medicine, which is a slow motion process, which is of course creating problems in the financial system, which will eventually undermine the financial structure. But it's essentially about buying time. It's giving governments the opportunity to do something more constructive, expansionary fiscal policy I have in mind here. Or perhaps the hope is that China and the US might provide the stimulus, right? The old German model, rely on exports to bail out the Eurozone economy, I should now say. So this is one option. The other option is what Mr. Issing seems to have in mind, Issing and his friends, this recent letter in the FAZ. They seem to like, it looks like they don't like this medicine, where then they are looking for harsher medicine, and that would mean more immediate damage for Germany. We see the Bundesbank Weidmann playing out this strange game now, clearly in opposition to the ECB and the euro, playing to the German audience, upholding German monetary mythology. This is very unsound, this is very unhealthy, very dangerous. So, if I may, I'm coming to an end here. So I started out researching on European integration when I was asked, this was my first job at Cambridge, I was asked to give a lecture course on European economic and monetary union, and I became excited about the subject and have researched on it ever since. Now, if I look at my first conference contributions, papers, I see that I pointed out, well, if you have a large economy of this kind, you need proper demand management, and you need to avoid those internal divergences, right? So this is kind of what a fresh PhD student, by looking at the issue, came up with. And I'm not saying this to shower praise on me, because I know there are many people in the audience who clearly understood these issues well. So the point I'm making is really, if you study proper macroeconomics, then these things should be obvious. Whereas if you go through the unlearning of macroeconomics that the mainstream has engaged in for the last few decades, then apparently you don't see these problems. Now, the most interesting point is our ordo friends, Germany's peculiar ordoliberals. And I mentioned Mr. Ising before. Now, the thing here is, if you look at the track record of him at the Bundesbank, misreading, monetary overshooting after German unification, if you look at the kind of things he said when he was at the ECB, how is it possible that someone with an outstanding track record of being persistently wrong can still be a hero of Ordo in Germany? How is that possible? Somebody has to explain that to me. Let me sum up. I focused on what I call the convergence of ordoliberalism and neoliberalism at the time of Maastricht, which gave us the Euro regime. We are still with that regime, we're stuck with it, and we're dealing with the problems. The key problem is Maastricht means institutionalized asymmetry, and looking at this with my Keynesian eyes, I consider this very unhealthy for growth. The mainstream, preoccupied with fighting the stagflation war of the 70s, does seem to see it differently, but I pointed out some of the ironies. We're now in the opposite kind of world. We have stag deflation, we have Japanification, because we've been obsessed with nothing but inflation and excessive deficits. I'm happy to report that the ECB has learned under Draghi and during the last few years that it has become a symmetric central bank. It is no longer the Bundesbank, so that's good news. But the other parts are still missing. And the two key things that in my view are missing are, first of all, a proper macroeconomic imbalance procedure that deserves that name. Currently, the thing we have is a joke. It's obviously not working. We need a proper mechanism to avoid those imbalances. And secondly, we need a common fiscal capacity, and primarily to deal with common shocks rather than asymmetric shocks. If we have a macroeconomic imbalance procedure, then those asymmetric apparent shocks will, in my view, not be much of an issue, but we need a mechanism to deal with common shocks and crises. And I Jan referred to my Euro Treasury idea. I will not repeat that here. Unfortunately, we keep on barking up the wrong tree. Unfortunately, debates still focus on asymmetric shocks and structural reforms and so on. The German position, these ordoliberal tinkering ideas, will not give us anything, I think. So this is why I think we're still in denial and delusion, and we're not really addressing the issues. Thank you very much.